I amassed $1 million in 3 houses in equity over time. And I'm really passionate about teaching people how to do that, right? I think that people think about like, okay, I can't do this, but I'm proof that you can.
Man, if you will just make a little bit of sacrifice up front, even if that means maybe living with family for a year or so you can save up the money to be able to do it, right? Living rent-free somewhere. Hey guys, I'm your host, Jax Crider, and we are on Financial Mastery Simplified, where our goal is to take any kind of financial concepts or things that are touching the financial space and simplify it down, making it obtainable to you so that you can easily understand these kind of concepts. So today, our guest is Mr. Keith. And Keith and I have known each other for a period of time. We actually met in our video coaching sessions with the wonderful Miss McCall Jones. And so anyhow, Keith and I have been really good friends for a long time. And Keith and I are actually in the same space. So I'm going to let him kind of introduce himself, kind of give him a little bit of a rundown of like what he does and how he kind of got into all these things. Because Keith is not just a man of one hat. He wears a few hats. And so Keith, kind of welcome to the show and kind of tell everybody a little bit about yourself and what you do and all those good things.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate you having me on. And I love that you're trying to get out there and teach people financial literacy because it's really, really important. My background started, 20 years ago when I was sitting in a cubicle at a insurance company. I was a claims adjuster. And I can remember I just got out of college and had a bunch of student loans. And I just decided that I wanted to pay all those things off. And I didn't want to go into life with like a lot of debt, and bought my first house after when I got into the mortgage industry, like in 2001. Right after that, of course, I bought my first house. I mean, we all do, I think. Like I bought my first house in 2003 and bought it for like $160,000. I'm from Franklin, Tennessee. That's where I live currently right now. And lived in it for like 1 year because I had to move my family down to Florida a year later. So we rented it out right when I bought it. We rented it out barely for the same amount of money that we were paying on it. I think it was like $1,200 was our payment. And then we started renting it
Oh, the
out
good
for
old
like,
days.
yeah, the good old days. Yeah, not now. Yeah. So we rented it out for like almost the exact same. And I can remember thinking, oh my God, I'm going to lose so much money on this because like I can barely make any money, right? I was actually losing money because if you think about it, when you're a landlord, there's expense that goes along with that.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
things that you don't think about, like you've got to paint or you've got to do carpet when somebody moves out. So I was really young and very inexperienced and didn't really understand it. But I knew that I had this vision that I wanted multiple properties in the future. And I just kind of dove in and did it. And thank God I did, because now years later, that same house is worth almost 600,000, and we're renting it out not for 1,200 now, but for 3,200, which
Nice.
is a blessing, right? And then
Yeah.
that's really kind of what got me moving in the mortgage industry, really focusing on helping people build wealth as opposed to just doing mortgage after mortgage,
Sure.
Um, and then I did that again about 8 years ago with a house that was 450,000 in Franklin. And now it's worth about 800. And we're renting that one out and making about 400 off of it. Then we took both of those. This would make Dave Ramsey's hair stand on end, right? He would be like, "Oh my God, that's stupid. Why did you do that?" But there was a method to the madness. We took both of those two houses that I told you about, and we mortgaged those houses and bought my dream home, which is the one I'm in now, which is like we paid $720 for it right before COVID, and then now it's worth 1.1 or so. So in that period of time, doing kind of the opposite of what Dave would have told us to do, right? I amassed $1 million in 3 houses in equity over time. And I'm really passionate about teaching people how to do that, right?
Right.
Because I can't think of, and we've talked about this before, but I can't think of a faster way to wealth than property.
Oh yeah.
Like, you imagine if you invested, a couple, money into the stock market. Well, first of all, how are you going to come up with $1 million to invest in the
Right.
stock market, right?
Yeah, you have a little bit of money, but you don't have like significant
No,
amounts of
God,
money,
no,
especially
no.
when you're young and,
Yes, and like,
barely making ends meet.
yes, I had like no money when I was younger, and so I think that people think about like, okay, I can't do this, but I'm proof that you can, because I started in my mid 20s with a $160,000 house, and I know you can't buy that anymore, but it's equivalent to kind of where you would be like now. And over 20 years, I amassed a decent amount of real estate. And
Yep.
I tell people all the time, like, I couldn't even afford to live where I live if I wouldn't have started 20 years ago. Like, I
Yep.
couldn't even afford to live here, right?
Well,
So
I was
anyway,
gonna say I have that conversation all the time. So the difference between myself and my brother, like as far as financial worth goes, is the fact that I bought my house 4 years sooner than he did. And I mean in age, not in real time, right? In like
yeah,
4 years in age, I bought my house sooner. And a lot of people, they're like, but you really had to like kind of stretch yourself a little bit to do it. And I did. But I knew ultimately that the biggest wealth differentiator, I mean, if you look at all of like the really successful and wealthy people over the course of time, right? Not just like today's time, but like you scroll all the way back, like to the Rockefellers and all those people. The thing that they all have in common is they all own property, right? They all invested in real estate. And so, of course, people get freaked out because of what happened in '08. And there is always some risk associated with buying anything. It doesn't matter what it is. So I think it's funny that people make it to be property is so risky, but the truth is that anything is really risky, right? I mean,
yeah,
it doesn't matter what it is. It's all got risk factor to it, right? I mean, my
yeah.
husband and I, we took this huge risk on this more luxury property that we bought about 3 years ago, and it's about to pay off in a huge way for the amount of money we made in this little delta of time. But we were willing to take the risk. Now, has it been stressful as all heck? Absolutely. It doesn't always go exactly according to plan. And my story is a lot crazier than most. We won't get into all of that. But a lot of people just don't understand that the path to wealth a lot of times is through real estate. And a lot of that is because of a few things, right? Like, number one, you are outlaying a certain amount of money anyways for somewhere to live. Like, unless you're living with family or somebody's kind enough to give you a place rent free, which is very unlikely, you're going to be paying that money anyways, right? Maybe not quite as much, but you're going to be paying something. Some amount of money is going to be leaving your pocket, right?
Yep.
And then also you're taking that appreciation, and regardless of if it's not a lot one year, eventually over time, like you said, it will show up, right? Maybe it's not a year over year the exact same amount and whatever, but like in Texas, just like Tennessee, we have gone crazy huge on the appreciation side, big time.
100%. And, it's not all roses, just like you said. In between my story there, when we went to Florida, I did one of the worst things I could have ever done, which is bought a house in 2005. So bought a
That's when I
house
bought my
in Florida.
I bought my house in '04. No, you're right. I bought mine in '05 too. My first
Yeah.
house.
Yeah. So I mean, this is, I don't, I don't leave this part of the story out sometimes, but this is the truth. We bought a house in '05 and we put this pool in, and I was working at a lender back then. I was an account executive. We put this gigantic pool in. It was amazing. The house was worth, 250,000, 300,000. I can't remember exactly. Overnight, it goes to like 120, right? Because of the mortgage crash.
Yep.
But we were strategic, knew how to deal with it, and got out of it, right? And restarted and rebuilt, and went from losing that house to keeping the one house that I told you about, and then building the rest of the wealth. So not only in that 20 years did I build the wealth, but I took a gigantic loss on one of those houses too,
Right.
And
Well, I
I
was gonna
think
say, I
that,
mean, sometimes it just doesn't always exactly work out, and I think what I'm seeing, and I don't know if you're seeing this in our space, but like a lot of people don't really want to make the requisite sacrifice to be able to get in that first place. Like they want it to be almost like the perfect house right off the rip. I mean, my first house was not the
oh
perfect
gosh,
house,
no.
right? I mean, it was not perfect. It was not, I mean, it
No.
was nice, but it was very much what I could figure out how to afford and what I could get myself into, right? Like I was
Yeah.
willing to make the sacrifice and eat beans and rice if I had to, because I knew the long-term play was worth the risk. And a lot of people don't necessarily talk about that piece because we're so YOLO, consumer nation. And I'm the worst too. Like I buy way too much crap. I talk about that all the time. I spend way too much money on just dumb stuff. I mean, you and I talk all the time about why did we buy that? Like
Oh
I
yeah.
have 800
Oh
things
yeah.
I don't really need. Um,
Yeah.
but a lot of times what people don't think about or realize is that, man, if you will just make a little bit of sacrifice up front, even if that means maybe living with family for a year or so you can save up the money to be able to do it, right? Living rent free somewhere. Because a lot of people are not realizing that it's frustrating for the younger generations, because we've gone up so much, especially with the inflation
Yeah.
and the interest rates and all the things that are affecting our world, right? But a lot of
Yeah.
people don't realize that, man, it is such a great value from the long term. You have to sometimes like let yourself see the forest through the trees, the big picture, as opposed to just seeing like what's right in front of your face. Like, oh man, I'm not going to be able to buy it because I don't have the money or whatever. Well, you can figure it out. Like it is figure outable, right?
Yeah.
And if you can't do it on your own, there's great professionals like myself, other people. We know tons of people in this space who want to help. Like that's our goal, right? Is to figure out how to make it possible, even if the answer isn't that we can do it right this exact second, right?
Absolutely. I think those of us that are really good at what we do, we're really good at solving problems and like figuring out their situation. I've been blessed to talk to thousands of people over my career, and like it's always a new puzzle. You know what I mean?
Oh
It's
yeah,
always like, okay, here's what I got. Like
never
figure it
never the
out.
same ever.
No, but I can remember like that first house that when I worked at the insurance company, I was also working a second job and I was a bartender at TGI Fridays, like flipping bottles and everything, right? And I I remembered I decided that I wanted to buy that house. I worked like double shifts for 2 weeks to save that down payment. Okay, I mean like I think it was like $5,000. I cannot remember. It's $5,000 or $10,000. I think I worked crazy double shifts for like 2 weeks to save that, and could remember back then like, oh my god, I'm so scared to lose this money. Right? Like I don't want to lose this money. But now looking back on it, and this is what I tell clients, like that was so laughable that I was so worried about that. If I could have seen in the future, like how much all those houses would have built the net worth, I
Right.
wouldn't have even worried about it. So, yeah, you're right. You just got to do it. You just got to figure out how to come up with whatever you need to come up with to buy. And you're right. Like they are not in the same situation that I was in. The house prices are much, much higher, but you could still come up with ways to do this, low down payment loans, etc. But yeah,
Oh,
it's
well,
such a
yeah, I was
must.
gonna say we have, you and I both, we know of USCA. A lot of people may not realize that besides the veteran loan, right, a VA loan, it is
Yeah.
a 0% down program. Now, does that mean that you don't have to bring any money for like closing costs? I mean, there is some costs that you potentially have to like bring or negotiate into the real estate contract. Like there's some different ways and strategically you can get that done.
Hmm.
But it does require you to live on the outskirts potentially, right? Like kind of outside of the general areas that people might be interested in. But what most people don't realize is that if they can use that as like the stepping stone, either to get into that house, build some equity, etc., and then sell it and take it and put it into another house. Or like you said, figure out a way to rent it out, turn that into a rental property, right? Things like that. That's a huge thing, right?
Yeah.
And we are in a really weird spot right now. I don't know if Tennessee is kind of dealing with this, but Texas is sort of seeing this period where the rental payments and like the initial house payments, like used to, they would be pretty close, or sometimes you would even save money if you bought a house versus renting. And
Yeah.
right now it's a little bit the opposite. Like you are going to spend a little bit more to be able
Hmm.
to get into a house. But I
Hmm.
remind people all the time that, okay, I hear that, but remind yourself that you do not get to control what your landlord's going to do. And so in a year, 2 years, your landlord can increase your rent payment by 50% if they want to.
Oh yeah.
And a lot of them will. I mean, in Texas, we have this situation happening right now where they just passed a law where they're increasing our homestead amount. So
Right.
usually they gave like a homestead, credit of like, I think it was 40 grand or so. And
Right.
now they increase it to 100, right? So that's
Yeah.
going to lower all of the people who live in their homes. It's their primary home. It's going to lower it quite a bit substantially on the tax base.
Yep.
Well, with that law came that if you had not filed your homestead exemption in the last 5 years, you have to refile it. So what I suspect is about to happen in Texas anyway, is that all those people who were maybe renting out a house and had left their homestead exemption in place, because maybe they now live in Tennessee or Florida or they move somewhere or whatever, right? When they go to refile, they're going to lose it. It's going to pull those taxes up. And then that landlord is going to have to pass that along to the renter, because they're not going to just cover it under the goodness out of their heart.
Right.
That's not how that works.
Yeah.
I mean, I remind people all the time, the math is the math, right? The math is a math thing. Like,
oh my gosh, yes. My wife property manages all the properties, thank God, and because I'd be terrible at it. But what she said the other day, we set up a home equity line of credit, I don't know, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, on one of our homes, and now that has jumped from say 4% to 8.25%, right? So that
yep.
payment on that home equity line of credit has gone up. Well, you're right. We don't have a choice but to pass it on to our renters. It doesn't. We have to, but it's not like we're passing it on to pass it on. Rents were already going up, and I can
Right.
see that happening already. Like, proof is how I started. Renting that house out $1,200 20 years ago. Now it's 2,800 or so, 3,200. That right there. Look at that increase in rent in Franklin, Tennessee, right? There's no difference than what's going to happen in the future. Those rents are going to keep coming up, right?
Well, I
So,
mean, again, what most people don't realize is the math is the math. Like, the beautiful part about math is that numbers are the numbers. Like, you can't, yeah, in certain industries like accounting or whatever, and even in our space a little bit, you can manipulate the numbers a little bit, but still it's all a risk-based situation. Like, I tell customers all the time, you got to understand, if you're not getting approved, right? If you're getting denied, the reason that this is happening is it's risk-based. So if this is really high risk, then something else has got to be low risk to even it out. Like, that's just the principle of the situation. And a lot of people don't understand that. They don't understand. They think it's like a personal affront against them.
not at
You
all.
know?
It's math, just like you said. It's math and guidelines that are set in front of us that we have to abide by. It has absolutely no. It doesn't matter who they are. It's irrelevant. You know what I mean? It's
Well, I was going to say,
absolutely irrelevant.
I remind people all the time too. The underwriter is never going to see you. They're never going to speak to you.
No.
They are looking purely at what is being presented to them, right? They're looking at the pure facts. Like, what does that credit score look like? What is the income amount? How much money do they have in the bank? Like, they're looking at all these factors and then asking themselves, is this a good client risk to loan the money for? Now, the only thing that does change in our space is the risk tolerance. So sometimes people are willing to do a little bit more risk, and that's what happened and kind of got us into the trouble in the whole '08 scenario that most people don't realize is there was a lot of money that was flowing and a lot of risk tolerance. And so they were willing to make really risky decisions that on paper were never going to pan out long term. They just had so much money flooding in, and that's the decision that they decided to make. And so now, obviously, we learned from that, and we're not making as many of those really risky decisions.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I worked in that, like I was an account executive for several of those companies, and I can tell you there is nothing remotely like what was going on. Okay. Like, it's not even close. You know what I mean? Like, they were doing loans for, oh my gosh, a day out of bankruptcy with no income. I mean, it was a whole different world
Stated
right
everything.
now. Yeah. That's why
Stated
when people
everything.
say, when I see on the internet, oh, there's a crash coming, I always kind of chuckle, because I know that I've been through the real crash, right? And I know what caused it, because I was literally in the middle of it. I got a conference call when they shut our company down, and it wasn't just our company that shut down, it was our entire sector of those bad loans, right?
Yep.
They just disappeared overnight. So when people say, okay, there's a crash coming, no, there's not, because we've put such strong credit safeguards in place. I don't, and this is just my opinion, right? Just over 22 years, but I don't feel like that can even happen again because it's so strict,
Oh yeah. Well,
because
I mean,
I'm
they
looking
rolled.
and I'm seeing things open up a little bit. You know what I mean? Like there's some things that are opening up and there's some good products that are coming, but not at 100% anymore.
No.
They're 20% down products. They're things that are aggressive, but they're nowhere near as aggressive as what they were in 08, 09, well, I guess 07, 08, 05, stuff like that. Doesn't exist.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, we also have a very different problem now than we had then. So like at that time, we had way too much inventory. We had way too many houses and whatever. And like when those payments ballooned to a point where people couldn't afford and they couldn't refinance to, get it to figure itself out and all those kind of things, right? Then they're like when they dumped those houses, there was nobody to buy them. Now we have the opposite problem. There is not enough inventory, there's not enough houses, and there is a lot of people. Now people are not feeling that because a lot of people are sitting on the sidelines. They're watching because they're afraid of the 07, 08. And I actually sat at the epicenter of subprime when it melted at the company that actually is the company who convinced Fannie and Freddie to buy subprime loans. Okay. So a lot of like what happened, I saw completely firsthand. And people also have to understand that a lot of what caused our problem back then was a lot of the adjustable rate mortgage loans, but it wasn't the standard adjustable rate mortgage loans that we see today. It was the ones where there were multiple factors. So it was like it adjusted the interest rate as well as the interest only feature, right? Which was allowing them to just make a lower payment, came off of it at the same time. So what I always would tell customers is that's basically a double adjustment. You got hit twice very hard. And when that happens, your payment balloons so much percentage wise. It's just, it's inevitable that that's just not going to be feasible unless you had a giant jump in your income, right? Or giant amount of money in the bank.
Absolutely. I mean, there were there were 2-year loans. They were called 228s.
Yep. I sold a bunch of them back in the day, not realizing.
With 5-year prepayment penalties on them. I refused to do them. I would not do them. I would absolutely not do them. But I'd see the reps come in and say, hey, we can lower that interest rate a 0.5 point by putting a 5-year prepay. And I'm like, but how are they going to refinance at year 2 if they have a 5-year prepay? Oh, don't worry about it. You'll figure it out then. I was like, no, that's not a game I'm wanting to play with my clients. But they did exist, and those you're right. The adjustable rate mortgages are completely different than we were back then. Back then, as I remember, they were based on the LIBOR, but the adjustments were insane, right?
Well, a lot of them, so usually it's like, and this is like very technical. So let me break this down. So basically what happens with adjustable rate mortgages, when you reach the period that the fixed part, it's where it starts adjusting, right? So most adjustable rate mortgages have a fixed period. So, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, that's the most common. 3 can also be something, whatever. Then when it goes to adjust, there's limits on it, right? And so like it can't adjust more than a certain figure. And usually that's either like 1 or 2%. A lot of the ones back in the day were 5. They were 5% and it could never go down. That was the other problem, is that like if the rates had gone down, they couldn't, that right. Interest rate could not go down.
Yeah.
They had caps like that too. And that was a huge problem. Huge.
Yeah. Yeah. People would pop up and have like 10%, 12%, 14% interest rates, and they couldn't handle it. And that's, I still feel that and the stated market were what took everything down, is the adjustables that people couldn't refinance out of, right? That was huge. That caused a lot of foreclosures. And then just simply the fact that they, like those rates just went so high,
Well, and remind yourself, they were actually incentivizing loan officers to put people in a lot of the loans that were not necessarily best fit. So like in the course of my career, when I had a conversation with a customer, I was always trying to assess what made the most sense. And I've always said there's not bad products. There's just products that work for certain people. But when you're
Mm-hmm.
incentivizing a sales force to basically put everybody into one particular loan type that may or may not be beneficial for them, that is a mistake. And that's why
Mm-hmm.
Dodd-Frank rolled, where we can't get paid, extra amount of money for a particular product type. Because
Yeah.
truthfully, you shouldn't be incentivized to put a client into a product that may not fit for them and their family,
Oh
right?
gosh. Yes. I mean, uh, yeah. Wow. Back then, it was such a different time. It was way different than it is now, for sure. Just dramatically different. And there's a lot of things that were put in place that I think have helped people a a great deal. I really do. And I think that a lot of them were justified and have stopped some of the illegal practice, not illegal back then, but the practices that were going on. Because I can remember, like when I was an account executive, those option arms, oh my gosh, we would walk in and those option arms would be just so brutal on someone that was like, it wasn't even interest only. It was
Oh
beyond
yeah.
a lower payment than
Pick a
interest
payment. So
only.
so let me break this down for you, for the listener who doesn't understand what a pay option arm or a pick a payment choice was. There was four payment options that happened with those loans, right? It was a 15-year, so you could make a payment that would basically have the loan paid off in 15 years, a 30-year, okay? So it'd be, if you made that payment, it would pay you in a 30-year. A interest only feature. So if you paid that, it was almost like renting, right? So like you're not changing the balance at all. The
Yeah.
balance was remaining completely consistent, right? You were just paying the interest off every month. And then what's called negative amortization, which means that you don't even pay the full amount of the interest owed. So the way that I would always describe this to my customers is like this. I would say basically it's like if you were renting a house and it costs $1,000 a month and you were only paying your landlord $800, and at the end of the amount of time you owed them that extra $200 plus whatever interest had accrued, right? So the balance was actually growing in size. And the bigger issue is that the customer did not know. A lot of the customers had no idea. So they just got this payment coupon in the mail. It had four choices. And let's be real here, you see four payment options. Which one are you picking? Probably the lowest, because that's the best decision for you financially from like a outlay of monthly cash. And so you're picking that choice, and then you're not realizing that it's tacking on. I don't know if I've ever told you, Keith. So I work for Countrywide, and when the crash was happening, Countrywide owned a third of all mortgages nationwide, and I backed customer service. So very often people would call in and they would be looking to refinance and lower their payment. And a lot of them were on pay option arms and had no clue. And I had to like walk them through this and explain like what it looked like and why this was a challenge. And I'll never forget, one of my customers was like, well, I didn't understand that when I signed the paperwork. So who's going to pay that money back? And I was like, you are, sir.
You
It's
are
you.
right.
It's
Right.
you
Yeah.
who's going to pay it back, right? And
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
didn't he didn't genuinely have a clue.
Gosh, yes, I can remember, like, the closing process back then was not super transparent as it is now. You know,
No.
there were many times where the loan would clear to close the afternoon and it would close 20 minutes later, right? Which always used to drive me insane when Dodd-Frank came out and, oh my gosh, we've got to have this ready 3 days early. But now I kind of, as I mature and become an older loan officer, I realize that was actually a good move because it gives the person the paperwork 3 days early to look through,
Well,
but
they can
back then that
see.
wasn't the case. Like you
Yeah,
would just
we
show
can't
up
bait
and
and switch them.
close. You
Yeah.
just show up and close. And unfortunately, there was a lot of bait and switching going on too,
Yep.
which I think we still see some of it now, but you can't do it at close because you get the paperwork 3 days ahead of time, right?
Right.
So yeah, it was a once again, it was just a different time than it is now. But you're right, like wow, yeah. Wow,
The
it just
thing
brings back a lot of memories.
Yeah, I was gonna say the thing that you have to remember, if you're looking at in the home buying space, or maybe you bought a house but you didn't really feel like you understood what was happening on the front end or whatever. So picking a professional in our space is really, really important because there is still a ton of programs and options, like tons and tons of them, right? I mean, the amount of information in mortgage space, like it could fill this entire room. There's so much information. There's so many things. Number one. Number two, understand that it's very different than buying a car where, yeah, you can go and submit a couple pieces of documentation and okay, you're good to go. Like, sometimes not even a few pieces of documentation, right? But because of Dodd-Frank and because of a lot of things that roll down, we do verify a lot more. There is a lot more paperwork that is involved in our space than there was previously. And so a lot of people get frustrated about it and they're annoyed. But honestly, it is for your benefit, right? It's to make sure that you can actually afford what you say you can afford, right? That we don't get you in a sling. And that, yes, you're allowed to stretch yourself maybe, but not past the point where it literally will be impossible for you to make payment. And that is what happened previously. People were just stretched to a point. I mean, I'll never forget as long as I live. This is an entirely true story. This woman called and she wanted to lower her payment, right? Remember I told you I back customer service. So she called in, she wanted to lower her payment. She had to pick a payment loan. So she had that negative amortization loan we were talking about. And of course, before she'd even said anything, I'm like, you're not going to be able to lower a payment on negative amortization, but let me just ask some questions, kind of figure out, see if there's anything I can help her with. So I asked her the question of, okay, so what kind of money do you make? She said, I'm on welfare. And I said, oh, okay, you're on welfare. And she said, yes. And I said, do you get any other kind of money? No, I don't. And I said, okay. And I said, so how are you affording the payment? Oh, well, I have some roommates. And for those of you who don't know, we cannot count what's called room and board, which means the people living with you, we can't count that towards income. Okay. So I'm like, oh, well, that's also not going to help me. And so I asked her, so has your financial situation changed? Like, were you making a bunch of money? And then, because, stuff like that happens, right? Life happens to each and every one of us. And she said, oh, no, I was on welfare when I very first got this house. And so they let her get into a house, not being able to make any kind of payment. It was a stated loan like we discussed or whatever, right? That is not the case now. That person could never have gotten that loan now. That would not happen unless she put all the people on the loan and she had a job or something, right? And they could all qualify together. Like that would not happen.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy? I just never forget. I was like, what?
So once again, a lot of things that happened many years ago were fraud, right? Yep. And I can remember as an account executive walking into some of these places and W-2s were being created. And I was like, I don't want to know anything. I'm like, this cannot go to my company. And I'd walk right back out, and, but there was a lot of fraud going on, and it wasn't just from the loan officers. It was from the clients and the realtors as well. There was just a gigantic amount of fraud that we were seeing. So when we talk about now, like, oh my gosh, they got to verify this, they got to verify that, right? They got to verify my employment, they got to verify my bank statements. The reason that exists is because of how much fraud there was in the past. Because people would take a bank statement and change the numbers on it.
Oh yeah.
Back then, I don't even know if it was Photoshop. I don't even remember how they did it or whatever. But they would change the numbers on it and they would send that bank statement in, or they would take a paycheck and send it in and change those things. And there was no verification process whatsoever.
Right.
It was like, okay, thank you for your check stubs. Here's your house, which in retrospect was probably not a good idea.
Well, and remind yourself that even though, and when you're going through the home buying process, listener, if that's what you're going through and you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, this is so annoying, remind yourself it's protecting you as well, because those people who are committing fraud, a lot of times they're the ones that go into foreclosure that kind of created the domino effect of why we dealt with the crash. And we don't have that circumstance anymore, right? What's happening right now on the fraud side is occupancy fraud, where people, and there are a fair bit of realtors out there who are going to tell you that you can buy an investment property with 3 or 3.5 or 0 down or whatever. Keith and I will both tell you that is not true. The only product that I know of that has the least amount of down is like 15%, and it's not at a pretty interest rate because of the risk factor. Usually it's 20+%. It's 20, 25+% down that you have to do with an investment property. But what you can do legally is like what Keith said. You can buy a property, you can go and you can live in the property 6 months, a year later. Now you are ready to move on to another house or whatever. you then can go and move into another property and use that same, 3.5, 5%, whatever it is down, and move along, right? So don't feel like you can't do rentals with lower amounts down, like what Keith was discussing at the beginning of the episode. For sure, you can do that, but understand the legal way that you handle that, and not committing fraud, is by you actually physically moving in and living in it for a period.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I've seen that too. Unfortunately, I've seen that.
That's actually the biggest kind of fraud that's happening right now, is occupancy fraud.
Yeah, and the biggest thing I tell people is that's fraud, right? Like it's fraud. It's something you do not want to mess with. It's something you do not want to do. And you're right. There are people out there that are unscrupulous that will tell you that that's okay to do, and it's absolutely not. I
was going to say, well, not only that, but you sign a form when you go to close on a house that says, if you commit mortgage fraud, it is a federal crime and you can go to federal jail.
Yeah.
And you absolutely can. And a lot of people will say, oh, but the mortgage company won't do that. Well, they can. And some of them are doing it because they're running into problems where, again, it's a risk game in mortgage, right? The reason they're asking for more down and a higher interest rate is not to be mean. It's because they're looking at the math and they need to make sure that they've covered their risk appropriately. And so, yes, some of them are going after people who are committing occupancy fraud.
100%. When the mortgage crash was a great example of that. When the mortgage crash happened, it wasn't like these companies took these losses and were like, okay, no big deal. The guys, they went in and looked at every single mortgage file with a fine-tooth comb and started figuring out what was going on. And that's why I think a lot of the regulations came from where they did, because people just went through and like basically deconstructed mortgage files and said, okay, here's a point where bad things are happening. Let's create a safeguard there. And you're exactly right. Like that process is really, really different now. And in no ways you want to commit anything like that. Even if you're a realtor, a loan officer, it does not matter. You've got to keep your morals and your everything absolutely correct, because you might not get caught now, but if something happened and there was a turn, it is possible that file get pulled apart. And, as long as everything's legitimate, there's no problems ever with a mortgage. And I've, like, over 22 years, the only time I've ever seen something happen where somebody was prosecuted or anything, they legitimately had done it, right? They had proof in a court of law with other people standing around going, yeah, this dude said this and this, and it was legitimate, right? So if it's just the simple thing is just keep everything, legal, and you'll be fine, right?
So Keith, let's talk a little bit, since we're trying to break this down and make this simplified for people, let's talk about maybe some creative solutions if people want to get into their first home or they want to try to build a rental empire, right? Like what you have kind of done over the course of time. What are some good tips on ways to kind of get started, right? Like to get the first place?
That's an excellent question. I think the first thing is the first home that you want to buy, you want to be really careful about the location, right? Because you're going to be renting it out possibly in the future. So what I did was I bought a house very close to a school because I kind of knew, okay, if I buy a house near a school, chances are there are going to be plenty of renters there forever, right?
Yeah, for sure. So families who want to be real close to the kids' school.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So that first house, a lot of times we go into this house, like you said very much earlier, which is absolutely true. We go into that first house thinking, oh my gosh, this is my dream house, right? I want this dream house. I want it to be the way I want it to be. But if you're going to build wealth, think about it instead as this first home, how can I make sure that I rent it out for top dollar in the future when I move out of it, right?
Right. Be strategic in your decision.
Yeah, it's like an exit strategy that I think a lot of people don't think about. And I always talk to my clients about this on the first house. And I'll ask them, and there's always two camps. There's two camps of people. It's either they're interested in learning what we're talking about, right, which is building multiple homes, or they're like, no, Keith, I'm going to live in this house for the rest of my life, right? And that's fine. That's absolutely fine.
Well, or they'll use that house to turn around and get equity and then go to their next bigger house or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But it's the same
Yeah.
rule of thumb, honestly, when you're thinking about strategy, because people are going to want to buy the house close to the school or whatever, right? Like, just like it's going to be attractive to renters, it's also going to be attractive to other first-time home buyers, or, people who want to be close to their children's school, etc. So
Yes.
it's a good tip overall, right? I would
Yes.
say my tip is that you can do things non-traditionally, aka, yes, we can't count your room and board income, right? So having like roommates. But if you're not married and you're young and you're thinking, hey, I want to get a place, find a couple of solid friends that want to pay less a little bit, maybe on rent, and rent a room from you, right?
Hmm.
Good way for you to be able to build that equity in a first place, right? You're the one who owns the house. And then
Hmm.
eventually, if you decide you don't want to be there anymore, just replace yourself as a renter, right? Find
Hmm.
another person to take over your room.
Absolutely. I love duplexes and triplexes also for that reason, just simply because now those you can actually use
Yes,
that income, right? So
yes,
you can
you can.
use that income of those other rental agreements, which is tremendous because you can buy more house that way. If you have rentals that are already coming in, I've seen people buy triplexes in the 700, $800,000 range, where they would normally qualify much lower because they were able to bring those renters in.
Yep,
Another thing I was thinking about, and this will fly in the face of most everybody out there, I think, but don't refinance all your equity away. That drives me insane, right? There's a
yep.
lot of unscrupulous, and I'll say it, servicers, the servicers that
Oh,
you
yeah,
have that are taking your checks. That's their job, is to take your checks, but I really feel like they're refinancing the equity out of so many people. I had a client the other day that called me, and he was like, Keith, my servicer's telling me that I can refinance to 5.5% right now. And I was like, okay, but what's it going to put on your balance? Well, it's like, $7,000 that's going to add to my balance, but I'm going to save it over the life of the loan. And I was like, well, sir, you're going to refinance probably within 12 months anyway when rates naturally go down. What happens to that $7,000 at that point? He
right.
goes, well, I didn't think about it that way. So a lot of times we're equity stripping people, or the servicers are equity stripping people, and it takes a real professional to look at a refinance and determine whether it really needs to be done or not.
Oh,
You
absolutely.
know?
We've had at least 10 clients reach out in the last year to ask about looking to consolidate debt. And only 2 of the 10 did it make sense for. And we had
Yeah.
to really like strip down, like one of them, we were eliminating private mortgage insurance as well as saving them money on their debts. And they had a ton of high interest credit cards. So it made sense, right? Like we could balance it out and make sense of
Sure.
it. But like you really have to be really careful, especially their VA lenders are notorious for this. Like convincing you, oh, well, you're going to skip 1 or 2 payments, so you should do this,
Right. Oh my
right?
gosh.
And so,
Yes.
like, when in doubt, you guys, if you have any questions, try to find a local professional. Try to find somebody that you have gone on to maybe their website or whatever, and you've seen the information that they're providing, and they're truly trying to educate the consumer. Because
Hmm.
the truth of the matter is there's those of us in our industry who really do care and who will tell you, even if it's we're not going to make any money, tell you, hey, it really just doesn't make sense for you, right? I mean, I've told so
Absolutely.
many customers that over my career because it's the right thing to do, right? It's the right thing to do to not just take their money and run because it doesn't make financial sense, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, to kind of wrap up because we're kind of at the end of time here, Keith, but
Okay.
and thank you so much for being a guest. You
Sure.
know, things are different than they were back in '08, right? They're not the same. Yes, mortgage can be complicated, but if you find the right group of individuals or whatever, right? Like they will help you sort it through. They will help you figure it out. You can use real estate to really catapult yourself on the wealth platform, right? I mean, it can really be a huge wealth differentiator and bigger and a lot of times than regular old investments because of the fact that you are kind of investing in something that you can't just go take the cash out of, right? Like your 401k, even though, yes, it is probably harder to take it out, you know that you can liquidate that sucker if you really need to, right?
Yeah.
House is a little bit harder. Like you have to come through Keith and I. You gotta you gotta work for it, right? So you definitely can use this as a platform to create wealth. Keith, do you have any last thoughts before we go?
No, I was just thinking, I grew up very poor, right? And real estate has allowed me to kind of get to where I am now. I couldn't have afforded some of the things that I did if I wouldn't have got into real estate years ago. So I think that if anybody's out there and they're thinking, oh my gosh, somebody's telling me not to buy right now or not to buy, period, just realize that it is a path to wealth. It really is a path to wealth. And just do your research and talk to a good professional. And I would say one more thing, which is there's a lot of just refinance lenders out there, right? They're kind of what we used to call chop shops, right?
Yep.
They bring in these inexperienced salespeople and they will just call you over and over again and basically beat you down. If you guys are going to do business with somebody, make sure that they've done purchases and they're consistently doing purchases,
Right.
because there's a huge difference between refinance lenders and purchase lenders, and you need both of that information when you're working with those people. But yeah, other than that, this has been amazing. I don't talk about this a lot anymore just because of where I am, and in my own business. So this has been a lot of fun to kind of really, review some of these memories from the past. It's really cool. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. And hopefully you'll tune in next week for another episode of Financial Mastery Simplified, where we are trying to take the complicated different kinds of financial concepts and what touches the financial space and simplify it down and make it easy to understand. Have a great one.
Bye, guys.